In the last video, we have added some code to our sign-in page so that we can sign in the user anonymously with Firebase. And the way we have done that is by defining this method called sign-in anonymously. And at this stage, I want to take some time to explain a concept that is very important in software development, and that is the concept of asynchronous programming. And to explain this concept, I'm going to use Firebase authentication as an example. So what I have here is a simple diagram which illustrates what happens when we make a call to authenticate with Firebase. And at the bottom, we have our app, which is running on a device, or the emulator in this case. And when we authenticate, the app needs to make a request to Firebase and await for a response. And making a request to Firebase is similar to making an HTTP request to a web server, because in both cases, the device that is running our app needs to communicate with some host that lives somewhere on the internet. In practice, this means that when we call firebase auth.instance.signin anonymously, then we can't assume that this method is going to return immediately. Because what happens here is that we send a sign-in request to Firebase, and at some point in the future, we get a response with a user or an error. And in fact, what we are really doing here is to call a method which is asynchronous. And so making a web request or authenticating with Firebase are both examples of asynchronous programming. And in Dart, there are two main language features that we can use to deal with asynchronous code. And these features are called futures and streams. And we will talk about futures and streams extensively on this course. For now, what you need to know is that signing anonymously is a method that returns a future. So I can get back to Android Studio, and what I want to show you now is that if we click through the documentation for signing anonymously, then we can see that this is a method that returns a future of out result. Okay, but what is a future? And the way I like to think about this is that a future is like a box that contains a value, and that value is not available immediately, but it will be in the future. So the question is, how do you get a value out of a future? And the answer is that you need to use a special keyword called await. So what happens over here is that I'm calling this method that returns a future of out result. However, what I really want to do is to get the out result inside that future. And to do that, I need to use await. And just to clarify, over here we could try to remove the await keyword, and we can see that we will get a warning telling us that the getter user isn't defined for the class future of out result. And the reason we get that is that we haven't unboxed the value inside the future. So from now on, the thing that we need to know is that every time we call a method that returns a future and we want to get the value out of that future, we need to use await like this. Okay, so the next thing that I need to explain is this async keyword over here. And what this async keyword does is to specify that this method called signing anonymously is asynchronous. So the next thing that you need to know is that when you declare a method and inside the method body you have one or more await calls, such as this one, then you need to mark that method as async. So in practice, you will see that whenever we use methods that return futures, then very often we will also have a pair of await and async keywords. Now, at this stage, you might ask one question, and that question is, should the sign-in anonymously method that we have created also return a future? And this seems reasonable because this actually is an asynchronous method. So the answer to that question is that whenever we declare an asynchronous method that needs to return a value, then the return type should be a future with the type of that value. And we have seen an example of this just a few seconds ago. And as we can see, the sign-in anonymously method that we have over here returns a future of out result. However, if we get back to our code, we see that here we have specified void as a return value because this method is just a callback and doesn't return a value. So strictly speaking, here we are not required to return a future because this method returns no value. In practice, I'm going to suggest that it is always a good idea to return a future from methods that are asynchronous. So here we are going to change the return type to future of type void, like this. And as we can see, now that we added this, we get a warning. And the reason for this is that this project was created with an old version of the Dart SDK. So we can fix this by importing a file called Dart async, or even better, we can update the SDK constraints. And we can do this automatically with Android Studio. But I think it's more useful if I show you how to update the Dart SDK manually. So to do that, I can open the pubspec.yaml file, and here I can find the constraints for the Dart SDK. And what I'm going to do is to replace this range with a minimum SDK version of 2.5.0, which will work just fine for our project. And then I can get back to the sign-in page, and I can see that the warning has disappeared. And since I've changed the pubspec.yaml file, I can get the latest packages. Okay, so this completes our initial overview of futures, async, and await. And I'm well aware that these might be new concepts that take a bit of time to get used to. So for now, I can give you very simple guidelines that hopefully will help you in writing asynchronous code in Dart. Number 1. Always use a future to perform asynchronous operations. Number 2. Use async to mark any asynchronous methods that return a future. And number 3. Use await to suspend execution until a future completes and returns a value. Before I continue, I also want to point out that there is a very good introduction to asynchronous programming on the Dart website. So if you head over to this page, you will find a lot of additional information on this topic. In any case, we will keep working with async, await, and futures in this course, and this will give you a chance to become more familiar with asynchronous programming as we make progress. Okay, so we are ready to continue in the next video.